This lecture is part of the Keystone seminar at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young, the instructor. We turn our attention now in the course to a reading of Shakespeare's play called The Tempest. And this text brings together the themes that we've been discussing up to this point. To some extent, this is still part of our discussion of liberal education and what it means to be an educated person, and there's a lot of commentary in The Tempest on that. But in addition, we've also discussed the concept of place and the potency of place through reading an ancient text by Livy, ancient Roman text, and also by reading Columbus's Letter of Discovery and Montaigne's essay on cannibals. And we've seen in Livy that the Romans felt so tied to the place they came from that they were reluctant to leave it, even when it was destroyed completely. They would rather go to the work of rebuilding than to move to another place, because somehow their cultural identity would be taken away from them if they did that. With Columbus, we see really the idea of the portability of place, that Columbus could lay claim to a place that was not his own on the basis of his sense of superiority, that Europeans were in some way superior to the people who inhabited the places he thought he had discovered, that these were somehow subhuman people. Some of them even had strange physical features, according to Columbus, that rendered them inadequate for claiming the place they belonged to. And so the Europeans took that over. And with Columbus, we get the concept, or rather the connection between the idea of place and the idea of the other. By the other, we mean really people who are not like us. People who come from distant lands or participate in other cultures apart from our own. Columbus obviously is acting in a very ethnocentric fashion in doing this. That was part and parcel of the time he came from. With Montaigne, this connection between place and the other is looked at more critically. And Montaigne asks, do we really we as Europeans, have claim to superiority just because really he kind of points out the reasons people give for this are rather superficial. The natives of these new places don't wear breeches, for instance, and they don't have a government or social systems that are similar to Europeans. These are the things that Columbus had pointed out as well. And most horrifically, they eat human flesh. Montaigne goes on to say, well, are they really so barbaric as all that, or can these things be understood in ways that make it not so horrific? But with The Tempest, all of that is kind of brought together into focus. And the first essay of the term will ask you to reflect on these themes, to bring it all together yourself in a way, and talk about how these ideas are manifest in all of these texts and what they mean, and how they should be understood and criticized, perhaps. So let's talk about Shakespeare. I don't think that we need a lot of introduction. I think we can probably assume some knowledge here of Shakespeare. I hope that they still teach this in high school, or that some of you have taken literature classes or something like that. Shakespeare, of course, began his career in the Elizabethan era. This is the late 16th century in England. Really, after a lot of the drama of the Reformation had played itself out in England, with Elizabeth coming to the throne, it represented the triumph of Anglicanism over Catholicism in England, and Elizabeth presided over a 45-year reign that was really quite prosperous and fairly peaceful, although the English were involved in disputes with others, and really their pinnacle moment came in 1588, about 30 years into Elizabeth's reign, when the the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada, and thus could lay claim to being the dominant military, particularly naval power in Europe, and the growing economic might of England also certainly rivaled any other European power, and this was the beginning of the kind of waning of the Spanish as the key power in Europe. Well, the defeat of the Armada in 1588 coincides in time with probably the beginning of Shakespeare's career in the theater. And he took advantage. He is a product in some ways of this prosperity and peace and relative success of the English of England in the late 16th century. And it should be said that it is really quite remarkable that the London of the late 16th century, which was a small city of maybe only 30 or 40,000 people, something like that. I may have those numbers slightly off, but I have heard that or read that figure trotted out there. Managed to produce not only William Shakespeare, but also a number of other kind of leading literary figures, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, eventually John Milton. That these all came out of what was a kind of middling-sized city at this point in time, and so there's something about the England of this time, and particularly the London of this time, that was really remarkable in terms of its literary output and its cultural influence. I'm not sure that there ever has been in the history of the world anything quite like it. Maybe the Russia of the late 19th century with the great novelists like Pasternak and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and others. But this Elizabethan England is a really, really remarkable time. There's the train in the background. I'm again filming this at home, so that's not a sound effect that I'm supplying. So that's the context in which Shakespeare lived and worked and wrote. Born in 1564, died at the fairly young age of 52 in 1616. Shakespeare was born and raised in Stratford-upon-Avon, a little town in the Cotswold Hills. Well, they're not really mountains, but the Cotswold Hills west of London. It's about an hour and a half drive today, probably a day's journey at the time of Shakespeare. He was the son of a wealthy craftsman, a glover, in fact, somebody who made fine gloves, and was educated in a school learning probably mostly Latin, which was sort of standard for education at that time. Shakespeare was married when he was only 18 years old to a woman who was quite a bit older than him, about 8 years older than him. We don't know much about his marriage or his family relationships. This has been the source of speculation among scholars and in kind of popular media. The film Shakespeare in Love, which won Best Picture about 20 years ago or so, is a good example of the uncertainty that lies around that leads to a lot of poetic license taken on the life of Shakespeare. But it's around 1589 or so that he begins to emerge on the theater scene, initially in Stratford and eventually in London by the early 1590s. He joined an acting troupe and eventually became the head of that acting troupe. And it was in this organization that he achieved not only his literary output, but also his fame, his wealth as a writer and as an actor. And it's uncertain which roles he played in the plays that he wrote, but there's a lot of speculation about that. His acting troupe achieved great success in the 1590s, largely on the basis of performing his plays, which were tremendously well received. In 1599, they built a theater called the Globe in London. This is the most famous theater of its day. They also purchased another theater, and so his plays were being performed in various venues in both Stratford and London. His career as a writer spanned about 25 years. About 1613 or so, he seems to have retired, or at least stepped back from the main role that he had played, and died only 3 years later. Despite some accounts that he was in perfectly good health, that his death was really quite sudden. The influences on Shakespeare are numerous and really too many to recount in a brief time frame here. It's certain that he borrows heavily from ancient literature, particularly Roman literature, though he would have been acquainted with Greek mythology and things like that, and that comes out in his work as well. But Roman literature, the ancient comedies from the late Republican period of Rome, the 2nd century BCE, particularly the plays of Plautus and Terence, which often have scenarios resembling very much a Shakespearean comedy. And also the work of Plutarch, who was a late 1st and early 2nd century CE Greek writer, though writing within the Roman Empire. Plutarch is most famous for his lengthy works called the Parallel Lives, which are a set of kind of moralizing biographies written pairing a great figure from Greek history alongside a great figure from Roman history to show that the Greeks and the Romans really are part of the same culture, the same civilization, partaking in the same sort of glory. Really kind of, in some ways, a propaganda statement, written by a Greek to try to champion the Greeks within the Roman Empire. This is where he got his material, almost certainly for, well, not almost certainly, definitely his material for Julius Caesar, for instance, and possibly Antony and Cleopatra and some other works. But the moralizing of Plutarch is also something that he draws upon from time to time. In the 1590s in particular, histories, plays about history were in vogue. And so Shakespeare, it's not a coincidence that he wrote a number of histories. He was really just responding to popular demand. Histories set mostly in English history, though he does use historical settings from other places in Europe. Romeo and Juliet, for instance, is set in 13th century Italy, and is very much true to the political factionalism at the time. The Montagues and the Capulets are representatives of or rather they are parallels of the Guelph and the Ghibelline factions that existed in Italy at the time. The Voyages of Discovery, this idea that there's a whole world out there that Europeans are only in the process of exploring, is very much an influence in some of his plays, and particularly in the Tempest, which is our assigned text here. And so we need to be aware of that and look at the ways that he uses the atmosphere of excitement and fascination, and also to some extent horror, at some of the revelations of the peoples and the lands that exist far away in these newly discovered countries. And then also Shakespeare's a great commentator, even a critic of contemporary life, the entertainment common, the lifestyle of the English. At one point in the Tempest, I think it's Trinculo is commenting on the sorts of entertainments that exist in London in his day. He says, if I could take this creature, he sees Caliban and thinks that he's kind of a monster. If I could take this creature back to London, I could have him in a show and I'd make lots of money, even if he's dead. People will pay to see even a corpse from some distant land. And so this is where this context of the growing globalization of the 16th and 17th centuries makes itself apparent here, as well as and colludes with the commentary there on contemporary life in England. Shakespeare has been subjected to a lot of scholarship, a lot of interpretation over time, naturally. He may be the most studied figure in history, in fact. There may be more written about Shakespeare than any other figure in history. And understandably so. I mean, his plays are tremendously rich and complex, and they can be analyzed from a variety of perspectives. Scholars have tried to periodize his work, setting up, sorry for the yawn, not getting enough sleep lately, but setting up a number of distinct periods in his work. His earliest plays were mostly histories, though there were a few comedies, it seems, written during that time, and the dating of his early plays is difficult. It's almost certain that Richard III and Henry VI were among the earliest plays that he wrote, though we may also date some of his comedies to this period, the Comedy of Errors, the Two Gentlemen of Verona, perhaps. Now, so these date to the late 1580s, early 1590s. In the mid-1590s, we see Shakespeare developing a more mature comedy style. Works like Midsummer Night's Dream and Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, and Twelfth Night, all of which are sort of high comedic expression of Shakespeare, with complex plots and great comedic sequences and such things. And then he began to turn his attention increasingly in the late 1590s to tragedy, and it's in this period that Julius Caesar and Romeo and Juliet and some of the more accessible tragedies were written. That then gives way to his greatest tragedies in the early first decade of the 17th century. This is the period in which he wrote Othello and King Lear and Hamlet and Macbeth, which are probably his most studied works. And then that period probably concluded with Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus. And then in his final period, in the latter part of the first decade of the 17th century, perhaps extending into the early years of the second decade of the 17th century, he did write some history during this time. Maybe his most famous histories, Henry IV and Henry V, actually date from the late 1590s, when he was beginning to write tragedy, and it's in those that he brings together some tragic elements and some comedic elements and some historical elements. I think, with like the character Falstaff in the two parts of Henry IV, maybe the quintessential character who draws together all of these strands. Well, he returned to this sort of combination of tragedy and comedy in his final plays. These can be called tragicomedy, they can be called romances, and Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and especially The Tempest were the products of this period. He did almost certainly collaborate with John Fletcher, who was a partner of his, to write Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen, which are probably his last works, but those were collaborations. The Tempest is actually thought to be his final work that he wrote by himself, though all of that, of course, is open for debate. Debates about which plays Shakespeare authored, whether he plagiarized others, whether he took credit for things that were actually written by others, along with, sorry again for the yawn, along with questions of his religious beliefs, his sexuality, and a number of other factors, and a number of other parts of his life have been subject to heavy treatment in scholarship, and the jury is still out on all of those things. At this point, I would ask if there are questions about Shakespeare. Certainly, if you have a desire to learn more about him, there's a lot of stuff written about Shakespeare. Even stuff that's accessible online, so I encourage you to do that. Turning our attention to the Tempest. As I said, this is probably the last play that he wrote by himself. Last play that can have a solo attribution. And in some ways it represents Shakespeare's most mature work. And it is one of the most performed and one of the most debated, one of the most treated of all of his works by scholars and by performers alike. Because it incorporates elements of all of the genres that Shakespeare wrote in. There are some tragic elements to this, there's certainly some comedic parts, and this is definitely a commentary on contemporary life, as well as some of the kind of macro events going on around Shakespeare. So this is a romance, or maybe a tragic comedy. It fits into that period of Shakespeare's writing and into that kind of hybrid genre. A few quotes that I wanted to bring out, and a few points I wanted to just draw your attention to. Certainly encourage you to read this text very closely, to think deeply about its connection to the issues of place and the other, the issue of liberal education, and the themes that we're discussing in this course. This is one that you can really take a big bite out of, I think, and you need to in order to write this essay. And we can have discussions on the discussion board about this. In fact, that's one of the things that needs to happen here. Act 1, Scene 2 is pivotal. It's perhaps the longest scene in the work. This is the one that sets everything up. In Scene 1 we have the tempest that leads to the shipwreck, the ship that carries the King of Naples, as well as Alonso, the King of Naples, as well as Antonio, who is the brother of Prospero, and the one who has usurped the title of Duke of Milan, or Milan as they would have said in Shakespeare's day in English, the Duke of Milan. And he, of course, is colluding with Sebastian, who's the brother of Alonso, to overthrow Alonso and to seize the throne of Naples. So there's some conspiracy going on here. But Prospero, senses their boat coming, and he's a magician. He has access to the powers of sorcery, and so he, whips up with the aid of his fairy Ariel, who is a slave of his, though one he has agreed to grant freedom to, but this kind of supernatural being, a sprite. And Ariel's the one who does all of his bidding. Prospero simply has the magic to control Ariel. So he, to his daughter Miranda, who is a very important figure in this work. She represents the power of innocence, as it were. She's a highly innocent figure, really a kind of a blank slate. I keep using that term in these lectures. We'll say more about that again when we get to John Locke, because he's a key theorist behind that term. Maybe the one who coined the phrase, in fact. But in his conversation with Miranda, where Prospero reveals his history, and it's kind of unbelievable that Prospero would have raised Miranda to be at least a teenager at this point, without ever telling her anything about him. They've lived together on this island for over a decade, it seems, and he's told her absolutely nothing, and she seems to be content with that. But now he's revealing everything to her. And he says at one point that he was a great student of the liberal arts, right? I mean, this is the educational context that Shakespeare came from, and one that he then inserts into his into the play here. Sorry, I'm paging through looking for, and this, of course, is the reason that he lost his hold on his title as the Duke of Milan. That he was too involved in bookish things, and his brother, who was more of a plotter, more of a politician, as it were, supplanted him from the throne. Uh, in his conversation with Ariel in the second scene of the first act, Ariel is angry with Prospero, quite understandably. He's been enslaved to him for some time. And he says, look, I've done everything you told me to. I've whipped up the storm. I want my freedom now. And Prospero says, not yet. And Ariel gets angry with this, and Prospero then reminds him of what he has done for Ariel. And it turns out that Ariel was enslaved by an evil witch named Sycorax, who had imprisoned Ariel inside of a tree for 12 years and sort of tortured him in that way. And so Prospero says, look, you need to remember that I freed you from this, and so you owe me a life debt. I will let you go when I'm good and ready. And he makes Ariel sort of recount for him what happened. And speaking of Sycorax, who is really a pivotal character in this, she's an old hag. She's a witch. She's the foul witch Sycorax, who with age and envy was grown into a hoop. That means that she was bent over with a hunchback or something like that. And Prospero says, "Hast thou forgot her?" And Ariel's like, "Oh, no, I haven't forgotten about her." And okay, well, where was she born? And Ariel's response to that question about where Sycorax came from is telling here. Sir, in Argier. Argier was the name, as it was known in Shakespeare's day, of Algeria, or really a reference to North Africa, to the Muslim world. And so one has to ask the question, why would he have this foul creature, this kind of demon spawn creature, come from that place? Well, there's some tension here. Now, we've seen this already a little bit in Columbus and some of the other things we've read. There's some tension here between Europe and the Muslim world. That world was seen as barbaric, even as savage. And so it's not surprising that Sycorax would have come from this place. And this island that they're on, to which Prospero has been confined, has been banished, is in the Mediterranean. This is not an island out in the the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific. He's not an island in the Americas. He's really quite close to home. But we get a sense that this is a pristine and unmolested country, as it were. And Sycorax had, this kind of, I mean, he doesn't ever say that she's a Muslim, but this witch who comes from North Africa, where we know they do kind of demonic and sorcerous things, she had taken this island and enslaved the population and had done foul, horrible things to it. The population, of course, not being human, but rather being, these fairies or these sprites. And so it's not surprising that, because of where she comes from, that she did these things. Nor is it surprising that her son, Caliban, is a monster. Caliban is treated very much as a subhuman in this. Shakespeare seems to have had no qualms about treating him that way. He's both gullible and evil at the same time. He, Prospero was kind to him, and Caliban turned around and tried to rape his daughter. And so this relationship between, and now Prospero, on the other hand, although I think we can read him in a different way using sort of post-colonial thinking, perhaps. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's, this is a interpretive framework that's been really quite in vogue for the last 20 or 30 years here, but which is, taken texts like the Tempest and have problematized them. But in any case, Prospero, according to Shakespeare, represents the forces of civilization. He is the European who comes in and does good things with this island. He causes it to blossom, whereas Sycorax had simply enslaved it. Well, whether that's the nice rosy picture we should paint of this is, I think, open to question, but that seems to be what Shakespeare's trying to set up here. In the same conversation, Prospero says, "Then was this island after the death of Sycorax, not honored with a human shape, though he does say, well, of course she did have a child, and that's Caliban, but we really can't call him human, can we? Well, with Caliban, we need to contemplate, we need to critique what Shakespeare was doing with that character, what he represents. Caliban seems to represent the savage, barbaric world of these distant lands. I mean, there's not any one land in particular that I think that Shakespeare is talking about here, but this seems to be, Africa, the Americas, parts of Asia that are uncivilized. And Caliban is the chief representative of all of that. These are not really human places. And they need the touch of a European like Prospero to do something with this. I hope you sense from the way I'm talking about this that I'm trying to represent Shakespeare here, not necessarily giving my own opinion about this. I do think that Shakespeare does need to be problematized here, just as he does in a lot of his other works. In his interaction with Caliban later in the same scene, Prospero refers to him as, "Thou poisonous slave, got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dam, come forth." Come forth there I've always found is quite ironic. I don't know if Shakespeare's taking from the Bible with the scene of the raising of Lazarus here, sort of a parody of that, but it's obvious again that Prospero has these very pejorative ideas about Caliban, and understandably. I mean, Caliban, he tried to teach Caliban things. "I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or another, and then you turned around and tried to rape my daughter." And Caliban says, "Yes, I did, absolutely, and I would do it again, and I want to people this island with more Calibans." He seems to be totally unrepentant and totally intransigent in his behavior and his attitudes. And so this is something that's wicked and wild and needs to be tamed by Prospero and treated terribly. This is, justification for treating these savage, barbaric peoples the way Europeans did it. Shakespeare seems to go right along with that. Contrast Caliban, who on the one hand is sort of untouched and pristine and uncontacted, but on the other hand is sort of inherently wicked. Contrast him with Miranda, who is of European stock, has also been raised on the same island with the same teacher, Prospero, yet turns out to be this lovely, innocent girl who, plays the role of a pawn, really, in Prospero's scheme to not only get his dukedom back, but also to marry Miranda off to Ferdinand, who is the heir to the throne of Naples, thus increasing his power. She's kind of this puppet in his hands, but she's totally innocent of all of this. And, Miranda, when she meets Ferdinand, she's never met a man before other than her father and Caliban. She nearly kneels down to worship Ferdinand and is convinced that he's good and that this is the man she wants to marry. And Prospero tries to make it so that she doesn't. Well, he's plotting the whole time, but he doesn't want to make it seem like Miranda's too easy here or anything like that, and so he accuses Ferdinand of spying on him. And anyway, her innocence is really quite striking, particularly in contrast to Caliban. The figure Gonzalo, who's an advisor to Alonso, the King of Naples, is an important figure in this play. He represents utopian thinking. And it's not surprising then that Shakespeare draws upon the text that we talked about last time in the last lecture. Gonzalo seems to be a kind of Platonic idealist, that he sees this island as a perfect place for potentially creating an ideal society, right? Here is everything advantageous to life, he says. This in the midst of shipwreck. He's saying this is a great place that we've found ourselves on, and if we only had the people, we could try to form a community here. And he goes on actually to quote Montaigne's essay on cannibals, talking about how much potential there is here. And, if we just apply the thinking of Plato or the ideals of Lycurgus or some of these other utopian thinkers, we could really achieve great things here. And Gonzalo, of course, is also the guy who aided Prospero when he was exiled. He, in some ways, is responsible for everything that has come to pass up to the beginning of this play. Sebastian and Antonio, who are not only complicit in the overthrow of Prospero from Milan, but also are plotting to overthrow Alonso, even to commit regicide and fratricide there. Criticize Alonso for marrying his daughter Claribel to a prince of Tunis. This would have been an alliance between a European Christian and a North African Muslim. And again, these attitudes about these kind of anti-Islamic or anti anything that's not European attitudes, that would that you would not bless our Europe with your daughter, but rather lose her to an African. This is seen as abhorrent. This is one of the reasons that Alonso is in the state that he's in. He contemplated doing the unthinkable in some ways. Act 2, Scene 2, where Trinculo and Stefano come across Caliban, who plays dead, and they think he's a monster, right? And this is where Trinculo sees him, and he's like, oh, if I could only take this thing back to Europe and take it to London, there would this monster make a man. In other words, I could have a kind of freak show there, showing off this person. They call him by various names. They call him Mooncalf. It's a long time before they recognize that this is an actual human being, and I think even then they don't necessarily accept that, right? Caliban is so strange to them. But his first thought is, I could make a profit off this thing if I could only get it back to Europe. And then the corruption of the natives, right? Caliban, who of course has this wicked tendencies, this wicked spirit in him. This is the one who tried to rape Miranda. Stefano and Trinculo happen to have some alcohol with them. Of course, these are drunkards. And so they give him booze, right? And Caliban responds by thinking that Stefano and Trinculo, who are really quite pathetic figures, are gods. That's a brave god and bears celestial liquor. I will kneel to him. And at one point he offers to lick his boots, right? And then he offers him, offers or plots with him. He says, if you kill Prospero, then you can marry Miranda, and she's beautiful, and you can be king of this island. And Stefano, while corrupting Caliban with alcohol, becomes corrupted himself. He goes native. He listens to the natives. He listens to this demonic, barbaric Satan spawn of Caliban, and becomes won over to his wicked ways, as it were. So Shakespeare seems to be sending out a warning here about too much interaction with, these peoples and things from these other worlds can corrupt someone, or at least that's the sort of potentiality that he's exploring here. Skipping all the way to the end, and I didn't intend for this to be a full summary of the play. I just wanted to point out a few lines here to get us going with the analysis of it. At the very end, in the last scene, Act 5, Scene 1, Prospero forgives his brother. I do forgive thee, unnatural though thou art, he says. It's interesting that the one person, this is a guy who tried to kill him. This is a guy who put him on a boat and sent him out into the sea with no, at least as he thought, nothing to sustain him. Not only Prospero, but also his daughter Miranda, who was an infant. That's a horrible crime. Prospero, once he has his title back, is perfectly willing to forgive his brother and sort of say, let's forget all about it. I've got, what's rightfully mine, and you can continue to be my brother. The one person he does not forgive, though, is Caliban. Caliban deserves absolutely no pity from him, it seems. And poor Caliban is kind of, his fate is open. It's still up in the air. We don't know what's going to happen to Caliban. we can just suppose that it's nothing good that's going to happen to him. Miranda's response upon meeting all of these Europeans at the end is, famous line here, how beauteous mankind is, oh brave new world that has such people in it. Brave New World, of course, being taken by Aldous Huxley in the 1930s and turned into the title of his famous novel, his dystopian novel that explored, really, I think, the implications of, what Europe, or what the civilized world would become if left to its full devices. But Miranda's really positive about this, thinks that that everything that she has discovered is truly grand, and if the rest of the world is really like this, then yay for all of us. We're great human beings, right? At least Europeans are. And then finally, in the epilogue, and this is, I mean, Shakespeare does this from time to time in his plays. He has a kind of epilogue where, some figure gives a sort of closing speech. In fact, that's almost invariably the case. Where the Tempest is quite unique is that Prospero actually breaks out of character with this speech and addresses the audience directly. It says basically, I'm giving up my magic because I want to be civilized. I want to go back and be in Europe and do the things that I like to do, and the sacrifice is I have to leave this island and I have to stop doing magic. I have to give up my powers of sorcery. And let me go. Let me do that. Well, this epilogue seems to be a bit autobiographical, or more than a bit autobiographical, that Shakespeare himself Prospero is speaking for Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare says, I'm giving up the magic. I'm not going to write anymore. And indeed, this seems to have been the last play that he wrote himself. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. I've done enough, and hopefully I've made you think enough that I'm going to let my work stand on its own and stand on its merits, and I'm done. Set me free. I don't know if Shakespeare would have walked out in the guise of Prospero and said this on the stage of the Globe, or what exactly happened, but this does seem to be autobiographical. Okay, well, hopefully those are a few thoughts that will allow you to delve into this text and think about it, and produce some really good responses for the discussion board, and ultimately for the critical analysis paper that's due in association with this. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.